Welcome on this Monday morning. Glad that you're here. Believe it or not, this is Matthew study number 60. Wow, how can we be at number 60 already? If you are joining us and been with us from the very beginning, well, we're glad that you've stuck with us. Hopefully it's going to be really worthwhile for you. If you're coming here lately, well, welcome. Couldn't have picked a better time to join us. We're getting ready to go into the Sermon on the Mount, so a great time to be here. We're going to be studying Matthew chapter 5. It's our habit to take just a verse or two every single day and kind of work our way through it. These studies never go less than 5 minutes, but never more than 10 minutes, so just a little bit to get you thinking about Scripture, and hopefully it can be something that resonates in your mind all day long. Today, we want to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. So let's get to it, shall we? Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. Now, there are several different debates about the passage that we're going into. One is the question about whether or not there are a very large group of people who are listening to Jesus as he's teaching, or whether there is simply a few disciples. Very cursory reading of this passage gives one the idea from a biographical standpoint. It says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. So we have this idea that there are a lot of crowds, and Jesus goes away, goes up to a mountain, and his disciples follow him and sit down, and Jesus is simply teaching his disciples. The reason that this is a difficulty for us is because we know that this sermon, or this collection of sermons, goes from Matthew 5 all the way through to the end of Matthew 7. And when we get to the end of Matthew 7, we see this. Again, it's the next time we see black lettering, everything else is pretty much red lettering or Jesus' words. But when we get to Matthew 7, 28 and 29, we read this. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So the idea here is that we begin the sermon with just seemingly just a few disciples. And by the time we get to the end of the sermon at Matthew 7, we see that there are great crowds who are astonished at his teaching. So there's a couple of different ways that we can interpret this, but the way I find that works the best for me is that Jesus did work to get away. And then as he continues to teach, more and more people are gathered around him and come to hear what it is that he has to say. The other big debate that we see happen here when we get to the Sermon on the Mount is whether or not this is one sermon or whether it's several sermons. Now, we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, but I have this belief, this thinking in my own mind that this is a concentrated teaching, but it may be a little bit more than just one sermon. It may be more than simply a 1-hour talk as we might be thinking of it from church. This might be something that took place over several days or maybe even a week or so. And we certainly get the idea that this is the very essence of Jesus' teaching, that this is the very essence, the very core, maybe would be a better way of saying it, of what it is that he wants his disciples, especially those who are his students, those who are learning from him, he wants them to really have an idea of what it is that he is about, what it is that he is teaching them. Now, we get this from several different places, but especially here at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 5, there's some, just some special words that mean something to us when we understand a little bit of the culture of the rabbi. First of all, we see this idea that he went up on the mountain. Well, who was it that went up on the mountain? What do you think Matthew might be referring to? Do you remember back in the first few books especially as we get into Exodus of the Old Testament. We see Moses, right, going up to Mount Sinai and getting the law. And here we kind of have this idea of Jesus now not getting the law, but giving the law. He's kind of giving his version of it. It's really a parallel in some respects. And certainly anyone who is Jewish would understand that. And remember, Matthew is writing primarily to a Jewish audience. We also have these words, when he sat down. Now, again, to you and me, this may not mean a whole lot, but to those listeners or readers of Matthew's day, this would be pretty significant. You see, when a rabbi would teach by standing or walking around while he taught, the idea was that these are more informal teachings and not necessarily the core of what he's about to teach. But when the rabbi sits, there is this concept that he's about to give you something really important, and that the very fact that he is seated is a visual clue to the student to really lean in and listen, because you're about to get the core of his teaching. Also, Matthew gives us some elaborate words in telling us and describing that Jesus is beginning to teach. He doesn't just say, and Jesus taught them, or Jesus said to them. What does he say in verse 2? He opened his mouth and taught them, saying. There's a little bit of rhetoric involved here, isn't there? This idea of him opening his mouth, again, from the Jewish perspective, when a teacher would open his mouth and teach them, saying, it's as if there's this oracle of God that's about to come, and you really need to be leaning in and listening to what's about to happen. Also, the form of the verb here is important to us. When the Greeks would write of the past tense, they had a couple of different ways of putting it. One is called the aorist tense, which really meant that it was past tense and it was said and done. So if I wanted to say he taught and just taught one time and that was it, I would use the aorist tense. But if I wanted to give this idea that he taught continuously in the past, then I would use what's known as the imperfect, and that's the verb form that we have here. In other words, he taught them, he continued to teach them, he was teaching them, he was saying to them. In other words, there's this ongoing teaching time that we see. Now, when we come back tomorrow, I'll refer to this a little bit more. We'll take a look at the overall structure of the Sermon on the Mount and get some ideas as to how this might be laid out for us so that we have an outline to be able to follow as we move forward in our studies. Let me ask you a real quick favor. This is a great time for someone to join us. So if you happen to know of someone that would be your friend or relative, and this is a meaningful help to you in your study, why not give them a call? Say, hey, I'm participating in this really cool online thing. It's a Bible study every day for 5 or 10 minutes, and I would love it if you would join me. That would mean a lot to me. Thanks for joining me on this Monday. Hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.